It could happen to you. Walking down the street to get a haircut, out with friends for lunch, heading to the store for groceries, when suddenly you see it. And once you see it, you never stop seeing it. On billboards, on buses, in targeted online ads, a candy-colored backdrop, a woman frozen mid-dance, the mystifying tagline, absolutely the #1 show in the world, and 2 words. Shen Yun. For some, the posters remain only that, an odd example of frequency bias, remembered annually as they reappear. But for others, they want to know more. US Google searches for Shen Yun spike annually each year, peaking in early January. After a plateau from 2012 to 2016, searches began rising steadily, hitting their highest levels in early 2020. An understandable lull followed, but at the start of this year, searches had already bounced back to 2017 levels. The omnipresent marketing itself has become a meme. Shen Yun posters on your phone, on a desert island, on the surface of Mars. And yet, whenever I mentioned to friends that this video was in progress, I would invariably get the same response. Shen Yun? Isn't that cult? It's not just my friends. The same Google Trends chart indicates that the 3rd most common follow-up query after Shen Yun is Shen Yun cult. Even among those who haven't attended Shen Yun, somehow it seems inexplicably unsettling. What does it actually mean to watch 5,000 years of civilization in one night? How do they afford those ads? Has anyone ever seen it? Is it even real? It is real. Because I have seen it. While this video will be digging into a lot of history and context, I feel that it may be best to start with that central question, and a quick summation of what happens at a performance of Shen Yun. Shen Yun is a dance troupe specializing in classical Chinese dance. The show itself consists of a variety of dance segments, each showcasing a different dance style. Women dance with fans and later with flowing sleeves, while men dance with bows and arrows, or with spinning handkerchiefs. Some of the segments are pure dance, while others use dance to tell a story, like the fables of Wang Zhaojun or the Monkey King, all without dialogue. There are even humorous segments. The Shen Yun 2022 program included The Rookie Monks, a segment that was split between traditional dance and comedic slapstick, as a group of monks defended their temple from bandits. The evening is accompanied by the Shen Yun Symphony Orchestra, a Western-style ensemble with some Chinese-derived instruments mixed in, like the erhu and pepa. Some dance segments have more specific origins. The 2020 program included the ethnic dance of the Yi, while in 2018 they included the ethnic dance of the Hmong. The evening includes musical interludes, from a solo erhu player to 1 or 2 vocal soloists. And the whole performance is tied together by a pair of hosts, a man speaking English and a woman speaking Mandarin. With airplane stewardess grins and forced jollity, they introduce each segment, keeping the evening moving steadily along. For example, from the introduction to the first story dance, "Our journey begins with the ancient legend that people were once divine. We follow the Creator down to Earth to fulfill our grand mission. Today, we invite you to discover a culture inspired by the heavens." That culture, according to Shen Yun, is the world of classical Chinese dance, which, if they are to be believed, is now being kept alive only by the diligent work of Shen Yun itself. As the program explains, the modern reforms of the Chinese Communist Party, herein CCP, have chipped away at the traditional beliefs and practices of ancient China, leaving it to groups like Shen Yun, or the spiritual meditation practice Falun Dafa, to pick up the slack. Now, what is Falun Dafa, you might ask? Well, the lyrics of the tenor's vocal solo, sung in Mandarin but projected in translation on the back wall, may provide a hint. "A way to heaven exists, 'tis not but a dream. Dafa is the vehicle to heaven's great heights. Modern thought and deeds make fools of us all. Behind atheism and evolution an evil spectre lurks. He calleth upon us to share Dafa far and wide." Similarly, the show's final dance depicts a battle for the soul of a young girl. On one hand, teenagers who are drinking and spending too much time on their phones. On the other, a group of smiling evangelists in clean-pressed yellow shirts handing out copies of a book titled Falun Dafa. Hold up. Is this propaganda? Because this is starting to feel like propaganda. Well, Shen Yun mentions in its program that it was founded by Falun Dafa adherents. The website says the same, and the book in question is being sold alongside CDs and jewelry in the theater lobby. The host, introducing a segment entitled Insanity During the End of Days, defines the practice as a meditation discipline for moral improvement. The dance itself depicts a young girl following her friend to the park, where a group of Dafa disciples lead them in a series of meditation exercises. But then, as the digital backdrop darkens, new dancers wearing all black clothing with an upside-down hammer and sickle on the chest arrive to break up the meditation. They chase the friend away and beat the daughter unconscious. As the digital backdrop changes to a sterile hospital setting, the girl's father, introduced earlier in the segment as a CCP doctor, arrives holding a fistful of comically oversized dollar bills. He sneers as he walks off stage towards where his daughter was carried. In time, he returns with an organ transport box, leaking blood from the lid. This, I will remind you, is all told through dance with no dialogue. The father is informed that he accidentally organ harvested his own daughter and falls into paroxysms of despair. But then, at the last minute, the girl's friend reappears and prays over her body. The backdrop shifts to show a mandala of brilliant colors, all surrounding the image of a Buddha, which the other dancers turn towards. As the music builds, the daughter rises from the ground, presumably still missing her vital organs, and bows to the others. Blackout. Then the hosts return and introduce the next segment, where men dance lyrically with bows and arrows. And it says so much about Shen Yun that for the moment, I'm going to put the organ harvesting aside and talk about their corporate structure next. Oh, don't worry. We'll get back to that. Shen Yun Performing Arts is headquartered in Deer Park, New York, about 2 hours northwest of New York City. As of this year, they operate 7 touring dance companies, which perform annually on 4 continents. And with all 7 traveling simultaneously from around September to June each year, it can genuinely feel like Shen Yun is in all places at once. For example, if you were in Richmond, Kentucky on May 7th, 2022, Shen Yun was at the Eastern Kentucky University Center for the Arts that night. It was also, simultaneously, in Long Beach, California. And in Providence, Rhode Island. And in Paris, France, and in Guadalajara, Mexico, and in Fuesen, Germany, and in Gold Coast, Australia. That spread also indicates the relative significance of the United States in the company's performance schedule. Out of all tour dates for Shen Yun 2022, exactly 100 were in the United States, compared to 72 in all other countries combined. For example, Canada only had 7, and Mexico only 5. So if the rest of this video seems focused on Shen Yun's relationship with the United States, that's why. Also, they're headquartered here. And also, I live here. This is all part of a larger trend of growth for Shen Yun. According to the company's 990 forms, they've grown from a profit of just over $3 million in 2008 to an all-time high of $26 million in 2018, with a gross income before expenses of $37.5 million. While recent years have been slightly lower, Shen Yun remains in healthy financial shape, with $144 million in assets and no sign of slowing down now that they can tour again. But for my money, no pun intended, the most fascinating part of Shen Yun's 990 forms is a single line. Page 10, Part 9, Statement of Functional Expenses, Line 12, Advertising and Promotion, where we can see that their marketing budget for all those posters and billboards comes to a grand total of $0. How the f*** is that possible? Well, it turns out, Shen Yun doesn't buy its own billboards. As said, the company was founded by adherents of the spiritual practice called Falun Dafa, also known as Falun Gong, which is the name that I'll be using from this point. In order to schedule the hundreds of tour stops, Shen Yun relies on local Falun Gong associations, which take charge of renting venues, putting the dancers up in hotels, paying for advertisements, and distributing the seemingly unlimited number of posters. Most major cities have an association of their own, the Asociación Lotes Sacré in Paris, or the Asociación Pro Arte Humano in Madrid. In the US, there are Falun Gong associations in 35 states, with some chapters covering larger areas, like the Southeast United States Falun Dafa Association in Texas. Here in Chicago, performances in the neighboring Rosemont and University Park were organized by the Mid-USA Falun Dafa Association, which is headquartered in Little Vietnam. For locals, Asia aren't Argyle. But not every performance is scheduled by the local branch. Shen Yun's 2022 performances in Seattle and Des Moines, for examples, were both sponsored by San Francisco's Falun Buddha Study Association, despite the fact that Washington State has its own association. Why is this? Well, as independently run nonprofits, every association has its own budget. In 2019, the Falun Dafa Association of Washington had around $800,000 in assets. By comparison, the San Francisco branch had over $8 million. So, they share resources. This is why Shen Yun ads are seemingly everywhere. Because the marketing is handled locally, they can get the word out better than a national team would. Plus, for some associations, marketing for Shen Yun may constitute their only major expenditure. While Shen Yun spent no money on marketing, San Francisco's Falun Gong Association spent $3.8 million in 2019, to say nothing of the marketing work done across all other associations. However, if you pay attention, you'll notice that the posters for Shen Yun change annually. Green in 2020, purple in 21, cobalt blue in 22, and navy blue for the upcoming 2023 tour. That's because Shen Yun's performance is different every single year. While the structure remains the same, pause if you want to read, the dance segments are entirely new. Each show is put together under the eye of the company's artistic director, a man known only as DF, a master of bel canto opera style who also writes all the music that accompanies Shen Yun. He's also an inventor, securing a patent for the electronic backdrop that all dances are performed against. The patent itself is for the innovative way that dancers can jump over the edge of the platform at the back, then appear seamlessly in the digital backdrop behind. In practice, it looks like they drop out of sight for a second and then appear digitally, but I'm not going to argue with the patent office. Now, while I've been trying to be as fair as possible to Shen Yun, it is worth pointing out that an artistic director who is known only by his initials, who is also the composer and is also an inventor, is maybe the kind of thing you would see in a cult. There's also the issue of Shen Yun's campus in Deer Park, which not only includes rehearsal spaces but also two schools, Feitan Academy and Feitan College. The pair are name-dropped by the hosts during Shen Yun as places where the dancers are trained. They don't mention that Feitan Academy is a grades 6 through 12 school, where students live on site and often join the Shen Yun cast after graduating, with some touring as unpaid volunteers while still in school. See, for people who haven't seen Shen Yun, the indicators of potential cult are basically just vibes. How can there be so many posters if I've never met anyone who's seen it? But for those who have seen Shen Yun, there are all sorts of little ways in which the experience seems a bit off. Listening to the tenor sing about Dafa being the one true way, then hearing the hosts explain how the Chinese government has attempted to shut down performances of Shen Yun, then watching a dance wherein the digital backdrop shows the wholesale destruction of Beijing, stopped only by the arrival of a Buddha. It's enough to have the sense that you're only getting one side of the narrative. There must be some other reason why China hates this dance troupe. The answer is that China isn't focused on Shen Yun. They're focused on Falun Gong. In September 1976, Chinese Communist Party chairman Mao Zedong died. His death set off a period in China that would come to be known as the Era of Reconstruction. Following Mao's ironclad rule, the new leaders of the CCP would exercise some leniency, allowing the Chinese people a bit more freedom in their everyday lives. Along with this freedom came a renewed passion for ancient Chinese philosophy and medicine, which Mao had suppressed. This led to an explosion in the popularity of Qigong, a practice of breathing, stretching, and meditation that people used to refocus their qi, or vital energies. Spreading from the universities into the public sphere, the Qigong movement was endorsed by party scientists as potentially beneficial to people's health, and by the mid-1980s, China was in the midst of what would later be called Qigong fever. It was during this time that Buddhist teacher Hongzhi announced, on May 13, 1992, the foundation of a new Qigong practice known as Falun Gong. Taking pieces from Buddhism as well as Taoism, Falun Gong claimed it was different from other Qigong practices. The specifics of how it was different would take too long to explain, but the one-sentence pitch is, Falun Gong creates an invisible wheel in your abdomen that refocuses your qi into gong energy in a way that allows the gong to stay with your spirit after your death. That's ludicrously simplified, but it's honestly not important to know how it works. What is important is how quickly Falun Gong spread. Li traveled across China giving demonstrations and lectures, and the Chinese Qigong Study and Research Association, or the CQSR, admitted Falun Gong as a party-approved affiliate in September of 1992. Within only 7 years of its founding, the CCP estimated that there were 70 million Falun Gong adherents in mainland China alone, not to mention the international branches Li was encouraging, as Chinese embassies invited him to give demonstrations abroad. Which, in retrospect, was one of the reasons the CCP eventually turned on Falun Gong. In 1996, Li announced his intention to leave the CQSR, citing that China only wanted to profit off Qigong movements, while he believed Falun Gong should be free. Following his departure, Chinese state media began a slowly escalating smear campaign in the press, denigrating Li's teachings and referring to Falun Gong as an evil cult. In response, Dafa disciples staged public protests throughout China, with sometimes thousands of supporters asking the government not to attack them. Li himself took up residence in New York in 1998 and hasn't returned to China since. The breaking point came on May 25th, 1999, when an enormous group of Falun Gong supporters, estimates vary between 10 and 20,000 people, staged a peaceful sit-in protest in front of the party headquarters in Zhongnanhai. 2 months later, the CCP declared Falun Gong officially banned in China, and on July 21st began a brutal crackdown. Thousands of supporters were arrested, beaten, or detained. The growing act of aggression against Falun Gong led to more protests, which led to more arrests. And then, in the spring of 2000, after making no public appearances for almost a year, Li Hongzhi declared a new goal for the movement: to clarify the truth about the CCP's persecution of Falun Gong, and to spread that truth as far and wide as possible. It was within this climate that the first Shen Yun dancers arrived, as Li explained in a 2014 speech. There was a group of Dafa disciples involved in the arts who wished to use their professional skills to expose the persecution and save sentient beings. According to Li, these early performances weren't very good. It distressed him to see his spiritual practice represented by such mediocre art. So the master stepped in. If a dance show was going to save people, it needed to be a top-notch dance show. Afterwards, I thought, I'll lead them in doing this. And that was how Shen Yun was first established. Wait, so Li Hongzhi is running Shen Yun? Then who's this artistic director, DF? Did he take over later? Do we know anything about him? And why does he look so similar to Li Hongzhi? Wait a minute! Okay, so, to be honest, I wanted to claim that DF is just Li Hongzhi wearing sunglasses, but, despite looking similar, that's not something I was able to prove, and I don't want to spread more conspiracy theories. Until I found a 2019 article in the French publication FRI where writer Jan Vandermade had the same theory. But remember that patent for Shen Yun's backdrop, the one they proudly put into the program, the one issued to DF? Well, Vandermade found it in the US Patent Office, and it turns out it was never issued to DF. It was issued to Li Hongzhi. Which brings me to the other side of this video. Up to now, I've mostly told you only what Shen Yun wants you to know about itself. Nothing false, everything has been true. But for a company bent on clarifying the truth, there are many additional truths about Shen Yun that complicate things quite a bit. So, let's go back to the beginning. While Li's 1992 book, Falun Gong, explained the overview of the practice, its sequel, Zhuan Falun, from 1994, was what really drove a wedge between Falun Gong and the larger Qigong movement. Most Qigong practitioners were only focused on the physical well-being of their followers, improving their health and mind. Li, however, began to claim that Falun Gong would help people spiritually, and that it would offer its followers a path towards an enlightened state where they could develop so-called supernormal abilities, such as clairvoyance, precognition, and for Li himself, the ability to walk through walls. See, when Li left the CQSR in 1996, it came after many warnings from the association that his Qigong sounded more and more like a religion. In fact, while Li claims that he left, the official line from the CQSR is that Falun Gong was kicked out, for slowly becoming a cult. In the following 3 years, as Falun Gong continued to grow as an independent practice, the CCP began to grow more wary of the movement. Not that followers might actually be clairvoyant, that was obviously nonsense, but about the challenges that an organization of 70 million people posed to the CCP's authority. So it makes sense that a protest of 10,000 adherents would inflame the desire to crack down on the practice. It makes sense, but that doesn't justify the CCP's actions. No group, however cult-like, deserves to have their members tortured. That said, while the CCP's memory of the crackdown is understandably sanitized, it's worth investigating the apocalyptic vision of events that Shen Yun presents in its organ harvesting ballet. God, that is such a weird sentence to say. The hosts claim that the events are based on true events still taking place in China today, but how true is that? As Gia Tolentino writes for a 2019 New Yorker article, the fact that both Falun Gong and the Communist Party communicate via propaganda makes it almost impossible to understand what's really happening. So let's look at 2 government reports that attempt to clarify the state of Falun Gong in China today. First, a 2007 report from Australia's Refugee Review Tribunal. In it, they were unable to find evidence to support or deny the allegations of organ harvesting specifically, but they did discover that many of the stories about Falun Gong members being specifically targeted were published by a newspaper run by Falun Gong members. Second, a 2015 report from US-based Human Rights Watch. They did find evidence of organ harvesting, but only from deceased prisoners, not from live specimens as depicted in Shen Yun's horrific dance. They also add that China claims to have stopped the practice earlier that year. Sure, I believe they said that. That report also clarifies that Falun Gong adherents were not specifically targeted, but were one of many groups that China has imprisoned over the years. Which, yeah, still very bad, but it does throw some water on Shen Yun's claims of China specifically coming after them. Although, I don't know, China doesn't seem like the kind of country to crack down on political dissent.
Hey, Zach, sorry to interrupt.
No, what is it, Zach?
Yeah, just checking in. Great to see you back making videos, but remind me why you were gone for 6 months?
Oh, I was writing an adaptation of Winnie the Pooh.
You wrote a play about Winnie the Pooh?
Yep, Winnie the Pooh.
Winnie the Pooh?
Winnie the Pooh.
Winnie the Pooh?
Winnie the Pooh.
Winnie the Pooh.
Winnie the Pooh. Anyway, let's get back to censorship in China. Or rather, efforts by Li and Falun Gong to counter Chinese censorship. An excellent article in China Review from 2018 indicates that in the 20 years since the criminalization of Falun Gong, Li's definition of zhen, or truthfulness, changed. Before the prohibition in 1999, truth in Li Hongzhi's theoretical system had obvious religious overtones, and it was mysterious as well as ambiguous. After that, the word truth was given strong political implications, concrete instead of mysterious. Rather than preaching about a universal truth that followers could approach by cultivating Gong, the mission of Falun Gong became focused on the political goal of taking down the CCP. To do this, they would assert 3 facts. Falun Gong was persecuted by the CCP is evil, and Falun Gong is good. In order to do this, Li fostered the creation of a 3-pronged media strategy in order to take control of how Falun Gong was presented to the West. The first, in May 2000, was a newspaper called The Epoch Times, which, if you've heard of before, don't worry, we're gonna get to that, which focused narrowly on US-China relations, always painting China in the worst light possible. The second media wing, established in February 2002, was New Tang Dynasty Television, essentially an audiovisual equivalent to the type of messaging put out by the Epoch Times. And then, in 2006, the third wing of Falun Gong's messaging was established, the dance troupe Shen Yun. Now, I can hear you saying, didn't Li claim that Shen Yun arose organically from dancers wanting to spread the word about Falun Gong? Yes, that is what Li claimed, but considering that their 427-acre campus containing the Phaeton Academy, Phaeton College, and state-of-the-art rehearsal spaces opened in 2007, and buildings typically take longer than a year to design and construct, I feel comfortable saying that Li, a man we've already established is running Shen Yun behind a pseudonym, may be stretching the truth a bit on Shen Yun's organic origins. And, if false, that would be only one of many questionable statements from Li. He also claimed that he mastered Falun Gong quicker than anyone else because of his superb inborn quality that allowed him the path of sudden enlightenment, which average people would find unbearable. He also claims that sickness is caused by the accumulation of bad karma in the body, and that rather than using medicine to heal, his followers should instead continue to cultivate Gong in order to atone for their past bad deeds. Then there's the famous 1999 interview with Time magazine, given 2 weeks before the Xiangnanhai protest, in which he claimed that aliens came to Earth to give humans computer technology, and when asked whether he was human, replied, "You can think of me as a human being." That's become the go-to quote to dismiss Li in the media, but for me, an equally wild yet way funnier quote is from his 1992 book, in which he spends an entire paragraph giving an example of the supernormal abilities of Qigong by citing American magician David Copperfield, writing that Copperfield is a master of supernormal abilities who once performed the feat of walking through the Great Wall of China. Cool. But all of these ludicrous, kind of funny statements from Li mask the actual impact of what he preaches. Li is adamant that meditation is not enough to build up Gong in the body. Followers also have to cultivate Xinxing, broadly defined as virtue, but better described as alignment with the nature of the universe. As Li sees it, the universe is built on the notion of Zhen Shan Ren, in English, truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. You see that image of the 3 characters all across Falun Gong's marketing, including within Shen Yun, right before the CCP arrives to knock out the daughter. While Li explained the concept as a series of platitudes, don't lash out against non-believers, break your attachments to material wealth, learn to see life's challenges as opportunities to strengthen your resolve, it served on the whole as a spiritual guidance to be good rather than evil. However, it was Li himself that determined what the nature of the universe was, and therefore, what was evil. According to Samuel Luo, one of the foremost advocates against Falun Gong, this includes homosexuality, which Li claims is not the standard of being human. Li also spoke out when the SARS epidemic swept through China in 2003. Li Hongzhi described SARS as a plague. Those who died in the plague were those who don't deserve to be saved, who are impossible to save while Dafa disciples clarify the truth, and who aren't useful to the evil rotter spirits. And while Luo cautions that Falun Gong remains a non-violent group, that doesn't mean that Li's outlandish beliefs don't harm his own supporters. In 2002, my stepfather initially refused help when he had a stroke, and he has suffered painful gout attacks unnecessarily for 5 years. He did so because he was being brainwashed into believing that Li Hongzhi has the power to cure illnesses, and taking medicine is counterproductive. See, the more I learn about Shen Yun, and to be clear, Li Hongzhi doesn't want me to learn much more than Falun Gong is good, the more I return to that CCP proclamation calling them an evil cult. Do I agree with the CCP on that matter specifically? I actually don't. As perverse as Falun Gong's teachings are, they do seem to be holding to that mandate to not harm people who disagree with them. Falun Gong remains free and voluntary, with no acts of violence committed by its adherents, and all followers able to walk away at any time. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that they are evil. I would say, however, that they are dangerous. And if you knew about the Epoch Times earlier, then yeah, you saw this coming. As one of Li's driving motivations is the destruction of the CCP, he was very quick to latch on to one particular presidential candidate who claimed that he would remain actively at odds with China. As such, the coverage in the Epoch Times began to tilt considerably right-wing, even more so when that candidate was eventually elected president. In the 6 years since that happened, the Epoch Times has expanded beyond US-China relations into all manner of right-wing causes, stoking anti-immigrant hysteria, protesting mask mandates, alleging that the election was stolen, and the rightward trend in American politics has benefited all parts of the Falun Gong media empire. Keep in mind, it was around 2017 that Shen Yun began to rise considerably in Google search frequency. And it was in 2021 that the company pivoted their marketing from the tagline 5,000 Years of Civilization Reborn to the much more conservatively pointed China Before Communism, which is a big transition from a practice whose 1992 book included the warning, students of Falun Dafa should take cultivation of Xinxing as the essence of our practice. They are absolutely not allowed to interfere with a country's political affairs, and moreover, they are prohibited from getting involved in any kind of political disputes or activities. Those who violate this rule are no longer Falun Dafa disciples. Now, obviously, we've gone so far down the rabbit hole of Falun Gong that you may forget we're talking about a dance troupe that looks like this. So let's pull back from the political quagmire that is Falun Gong and ask the question, why is this group running a dance company? Why rely on the arts to make an argument about your own legitimacy? And to answer that, we're going to look at another group with the same strategy, 30 years before Shen Yun. It's 1973, and the Republic of China, here in ROC, has set up a government in exile on the island of Taiwan after losing a brutal civil war to Mao and the CCP. Not wanting to declare a winner in that conflict and admit that communism had triumphed in mainland China, international governments hadn't yet made a policy of recognizing one of the two as the official Chinese government, although Taiwan was pushing hard for the US to recognize it as such. American diplomats gave speeches in Congress, American news media promoted stories about free China, and Taiwan engaged in a unique exercise of soft power, an international tour of the National Chinese Opera Theater. Like Shen Yun, the NCOT tour made big claims of its position as the only authentic version of Chinese opera. However, unlike Shen Yun, they had verified history on their side. In the 1960s, the CCP had actually banned certain stories from the Chinese opera canon in order to establish so-called model plays that better reflected the ideals of the party. And while Chinese opera had only existed for around 200 years rather than thousands, it did predate the rise of the People's Republic and had a more substantial argument that it was, to quote the program in an astonishing parallel to Shen Yun's own marketing, the embodiment of China's 5,000 years of civilization. But can performances of seemingly authentic culture serve as effective tools to sway an international audience to your side? According to scholar Li Chen, absolutely. In his 2016 article about Shen Yun's efforts in attacking China, he introduces the emotional duplex of nation branding and debranding. It may look complicated, but it's fairly intuitive. Very basically, it asserts that when a country presents large-scale exercises of soft power, like China hosting the 2008 Summer Olympics, those are exercises in national branding. If audiences like the display, it will lead them to develop a better impression of the country. Similarly, when Shen Yun denigrates modern China, it can lead to audience disapproval of China. So, did the NCOT tour effectively convince American audiences that the ROC was the legitimate source of Chinese culture? A quote from Yangqi Zheng's 2020 study of the tour sums it up best. The nationalist officials believed that Beijing opera would not just entertain Americans, but would also educate them about the ROC's international legitimacy, which could serve as a counterweight to the rising influence of the CCP. But the reviewers' admiration of these spectacular performances seldom translated into political endorsement. This result might have increased the NCOT's artistic appeal, yet it also defeated the ROC's political purpose in staging the spectacles. See, while Chen's duplex argues that soft power is effective at endearing an international audience to a nation's brand, it stops short of saying that soft power can persuade an audience to support that nation's government. Despite hopes for true crossover appeal, reports indicated that most attendees of the NCOT tour were Chinese American, who already had established thoughts about the Civil War and the ROC's legitimacy. The non-Chinese audiences who attended left impressed with Chinese opera, but not necessarily with the ROC itself. Falun Gong in the early aughts found itself in a similar position to Taiwan in the 1970s, with public sympathy waning in the West as continued protests by Dafa disciples yielded only minor results. As writer Nicholas Hune Brown explains, practitioners in North America have escaped persecution, but to live comfortably in suburban New York or Vancouver, while family and friends suffer in China, comes with a burden. There's a guilt among Falun Gong practitioners, says David Ownby. They hope that they will get Western public opinion back on their side, and they think that this is one way to do it, through this artistic medium. Where Shen Yun differs significantly from the NCOT tour, however, is in the directness of their political advocacy. NCOT did select the stories they took on tour with an eye towards how they could serve as allegory for the situation back home, choosing to dramatize a lesser-known story about a small army defeating a warlord, rather than the better-known story about that warlord's tactical retreat. But they never staged an original piece set in the modern day, directly depicting the Taiwanese people being persecuted by the CCP. Regarding Shen Yun's debranding efforts, Chen writes, "The persecution scenes in the Shen Yun performance remind the international audience of China's poor human rights records. Together with other debranding efforts from Falun Gong, Shen Yun Performing Arts helps to trigger feelings of anger towards China among its international audience. Through the affective economy, such feelings tend to accumulate and solidify into a general disapproval of China. Those other debranding efforts include all of the media pursuits of the Falun Gong, the Epoch Times, New Tang Dynasty Television, Li Hongzhi's speeches, and the protests of Falun Gong members. And according to at least 3 sources, 2 scholarly articles as well as my own anecdotal experience at the show, Shen Yun is achieving greater crossover appeal than the NCOT tour to some degree. Audiences are disproportionately white and older. But then the question becomes, if Shen Yun is actually succeeding at getting the Western world to attend their shows, are they actually listening? Is this exercise in nation debranding effective? Well, I can't claim that people aren't listening, but I can point to the numerous reviews on Yelp calling the show a scam operated by a religious cult. I can also talk about the many seats around me in the Rosemont Theater that were suddenly empty after intermission. And I think this stems from something Shen Yun actually has in common with the NCOT tour. Despite their explicitly political content, the show is still advertised without any mention of Falun Gong, and those modern set dances are preceded by nearly an hour of seemingly apolitical segments. Seen that way, Shen Yun is operating an artistic Trojan horse, promising its audience classical dance and then hitting them over the head with depictions of torture halfway through. And for an older, whiter Western audience who may have spent anywhere from $80 to $200 on tickets expecting a comparatively apolitical evening of authentic Chinese dance, that doesn't exactly paint a picture of a target audience that's coming into the theater ready to be preached at about the villainy of the CCP. Even if an audience member learns about the show from advertisements or stories in the Epoch Times and arrives with the suspicions about modern China one might expect from a US conservative, that target demographic may also reject the performance once it begins to feel like a lecture. There's a latent Orientalism at the heart of Shen Yun's appeal, the notion that because the group is banned in China, it will be free of the inauthentic depictions of culture that China targets at foreign tourists. But that said, an older, potentially conservative audience will want to consume that story from the comfort of their seats, without being implicated by the story of Falun Gong's persecution that led to their expat status. The fundamental error of the NCOT tour was believing that admiration of the art would directly translate to support for the ROC government. The fundamental error of Shen Yun is believing that admiration of the art would overcome a Western audience's unwillingness to sit through active advocacy for a marginalized spiritual group. Now, it is true that not every audience member fits this mold. This is also, as mentioned, analysis focused on Shen Yun's marketing in the US rather than their worldwide media strategy. Although I would point out that, with the exception of Japan and Taiwan, every country they perform in is in the West. They're not performing in India or Brazil or Egypt. But this issue of Shen Yun being detached from China, of its perceived authentic culture from before the CCP took over, that does seem to be a key element of its artistic appeal. But is it a claim that holds up? And what does authenticity even mean for a dance company? In 1964, former Olympic wrestler Rocky Aoki founded what was, at least going by the food, a fairly standard American steakhouse in New York City. The restaurant advertised no exquisitely carved carrot slices, no wispy vegetables arranged in perfect flower patterns, instead, solid food in abundance. But despite this, Aoki tailored the aesthetics of the restaurant directly at white Americans' misplaced sense of what they considered authentic Japanese culture to be. To that end, every employee of the restaurant was of Asian heritage, the walls were lined with reclaimed bamboo from Japanese villages, and the food was cooked teppanyaki style on a large griddle with audiences seated around the edges. That steakhouse, which would eventually expand to 116 franchises worldwide, is Benihana. According to writer Andrew C. McKevitt, for most Americans in the 1960s, as long as the chef looked Asian, the waitresses dressed in kimonos, and the decor matched their media-inspired expectations, the food did not matter. The experience still translated as Japanese. And it wouldn't be a stretch to argue that, in the time since Benihana was founded, the American appetite for what we perceive to be authentic cuisine hasn't changed. What has changed is an increased sensitivity in consumers about potential inauthenticity. We know to avoid something like, to give an extreme example, Panda Express. But in reality, the line between authentic and inauthentic is never as distinct as we would prefer it to be, in cuisine or otherwise. In 2006, the Japanese government established a Japanese restaurant authentication plan in order to, quote, protect our food culture by surveying all sushi restaurants worldwide and determining which were pure Japanese. But their effort was criticized by many within the restaurant industry. Many chefs rejected the effort as meaningless, claiming that Japanese food had grown beyond its exoticized origins to become a global cuisine, mixed, fused, and consumed eagerly. Indeed, the world's most admired Japanese chefs, like Nobuyuki Matsuhisa, have succeeded not by producing dishes that meet Western expectations for Japaneseness, but by creating entirely new cuisines that blend traditional Japanese ingredients or techniques with those of other societies. This issue of determining authenticity in a dynamic art form, like cuisine, is something I've discussed at length before, in my video essay on The Rite of Spring. Because dance steps only exist when embodied by a dancer, without the original performer there to mold the dance in their image, the dance, by nature, will have to evolve and adjust slightly with each performance. The notion of returning to a true and original form of the dance is not only a futile effort, but a rejection of the fluidity that is fundamental to works of dynamic art. Dance, like cuisine, like theater, is always evolving as different artists keep it alive through performance. Which is a long lead up to say that Shen Yun's claims of being the only people keeping classical Chinese dance alive are, how can I put this delicately, complete nonsense. Not only because the notion that a style of dance didn't evolve over 5,000 years of history is, when you think about it, an absurd thing to assert, it's also let down by scholars of classical Chinese dance, like Emily Wilcox. The author of 2 books on the subject, she studied classical Chinese dance for 18 months in Beijing. You know, that place where Shen Yun claims classical dance is banned by the CCP. Wilcox clarifies that the form of dance practiced by Shen Yun actually has a more recent history, an invented tradition arising in the 1950s and, since the death of Mao, supported by the CCP. To quote her directly, Shen Yun's claims that they are the only source of authentic Chinese dance is completely ridiculous and clearly part of their mission to exploit Chinese cultural experiences for their own political purposes without regard to historical accuracy. She added, in a later interview, Shen Yun's claims to purity are a way for Falun Gong practitioners to reclaim their identity from persecution, and that they're bolstered by a pre-existing tendency on the part of Western audiences to perceive Asian bodies and Asian culture as authentic. Shen Yun's claim that only they are the purveyors of authentic Chinese dance has the implication that China only has one authentic style of classical dance. But culture is not a zero-sum game where only one pathway of dance is the correct one. Culture branches off in unique and multitudinous ways, especially when that branching off has been going on for, remember, 5,000 years. Because when you really dig into it, there are a lot of claims that Shen Yun makes that are actually coded statements about the spiritual practice behind it. Falun Gong was banned in China in 1999. But classical Chinese dance wasn't, because Falun Gong wasn't associated with classical dance until the foundation of Shen Yun. In the same false equivalency, Shen Yun has little connection to 5,000 years of civilization being formed in 2006 to revive a dance style that only goes back as far as maybe the 1950s. But you know what does have a more reasonable claim of connection to 5,000 years of civilization? The Qigong movement, which revived ancient Chinese meditation and health practices in a modern context. In fact, when we look at Li Hongzhi's 2014 statement about how Shen Yun was founded, the connection breaks down even more. In claiming that Shen Yun began with a group of Dafa disciples involved in the arts who wished to use their professional skills to expose the persecution, there's no indication given that the artistic skills of those Dafa disciples was in any way related to their practicing of Falun Gong. It was just a group of dancers who happened to be very good at classical Chinese dance, using it to spread the word about their spiritual practice. How, then, does the authenticity of Shen Yun as true classical dance serve their driving argument that Falun Gong is good? If the dances are authentic, does that prove the virtue of the spiritual group? And the answer is no, it proves nothing. It doesn't disprove that they're good, obviously, but if their knowledge of classical Chinese dance had little to nothing to do with being Falun Gong adherents, then anyone from any spiritual group could have revived the practice. The fact that it was revived by Falun Gong adherents is immaterial. So, if the authenticity of the dancing can't prove the virtue of Falun Gong, then how else can they assert that truth, that Falun Gong is good? Well, if we return to Chen's emotional duplex chart, we might offer an alternative estimation of Shen Yun's tactics. The scenes of Falun Gong's persecution certainly invite the audience to dislike the CCP, but can those same scenes also inspire admiration of Falun Gong? In short, can Chen's duplex work in reverse? I'm not so sure. Perhaps in a vacuum, there is something to be said for the unsubtlety of Shen Yun's balletic depictions of torture and organ harvesting, particularly in light of the comparatively toothless soft power of the NCOT tour. But combined with the context of their other efforts in obfuscating the truth, their vibes are just a touch too off for the audience to fully trust them. However real the persecution of Falun Gong is, which is to say, pretty real, Western audiences need something more to truly buy into Shen Yun's advocacy for the practice. This is explained, at some length, by Nicholas Hune Brown. While Tibetan protesters and pro-democracy activists have always had the West's unqualified sympathy, Falun Gong occupies a more ambivalent space. Despite Beijing's insistence, Falun Gong is not a cult. It's a diffuse group without strong hierarchies, and there is no evidence of the kind of coercive control that the label suggests. But it is, well, strange. Without the ballast of thousands of years of tradition, all new religions can feel absurd. Falun Gong practitioners were being repressed, sure, but there was something unnerving about the group's presentation, their bizarre worldview. At a certain point, persecution doesn't breed sympathy, it breeds a kind of contempt. The 10th time someone hands you a pamphlet about the Chinese government oppressing the Falun Gong, your impulse isn't to write your local representative, it's to cross the street. Now, it may be possible to argue that Shen Yun is succeeding at its goals, if those goals are only to assert that Falun Gong exists and inspire audience members to do their own research. Perhaps even making this video essay is, in a certain way, playing directly into the hands of Falun Gong. But if that's their only goal, then A, that feels like a very obtuse way of getting the word out, and B, I'm not sure that relying on audiences to do their own research is as good a plan as they would hope. Many audiences won't do research, and many more will do only the baseline level of Googling, find an article or two about Shen Yun being run by a cult, and decide that that serves as good enough justification for why the show felt so off-putting. It has taken me nearly 2 months of research and analysis over Shen Yun and Falun Gong to come to that not evil but certainly dangerous conclusion. Simply put, if Falun Gong's goal is to clarify the truth, Shen Yun could be clarifying it a lot better. Because let's really dig into that 3 truths idea and whether or not Shen Yun is actually communicating them to its audiences. 1. Falun Gong was persecuted by the CCP. 2. The CCP is evil. And 3. Falun Gong is good. Shen Yun is the most direct about truth too, with the CCP thugs that carry off the daughter to organ harvesting and the dialogue from the hosts about how Shen Yun was banned in the country. That, mixed with cultural knowledge about China's growing presence on the 21st century world stage, can certainly make a pretty solid case. As for Truth 1, Shen Yun does push that point, quite aggressively. So aggressively, as Hune Brown argues, that it may actually push audiences in the other direction instead. Without the context around the larger Qigong movement and Li Hongzhi's spiritual focus, the only reason why Falun Gong would be targeted by the CCP is the CCP's own wickedness. In short, the only proof of Truth 1 is Truth 2. And the strangeness of Shen Yun may leave audiences thinking that surely there must be some reason why Falun Gong was targeted beyond the CCP's own malevolence. So with weak justification for Truth 1 and strong justification for Truth 2, we arrive at Truth 3. Falun Gong is good. And as we've established, the authenticity of the dancing cannot prove that. In fact, I would argue that Shen Yun's obfuscating attitude towards how closely they are connected to Falun Gong is doing them a disservice. They could use the performance as a chance to showcase what Falun Gong actually teaches and how it benefits supporters. A chance, to borrow Li's words, to clarify the truth. But instead, Falun Gong is explained with one sentence by the hosts, and beyond that, just becomes a nondescript series of stretches that the evil CCP has determined is worthy of death. Which leads to this odd pathway of how Falun Gong's truths break down when analyzed. Shen Yun claims that Falun Gong is persecuted. If audiences question why, they get truths 2 and 3 as their answer. If the performance provides evidence for truth 2, but not truth 3, audiences will look elsewhere to justify the persecution of truth 1. They do their own research, find news stories about Falun Gong being a cult, and that seemingly fills in the gaps in Shen Yun's story. Thus, the message that audiences take away from the show is that Falun Gong was kicked out of China for being a cult, and have now come to the West to sell their vision of the world. A world where the end times are nigh, where homosexuality and atheism are deviant, and the only people who will be saved are the Falun Gong themselves. And that message, for many Western audiences, does not have much of an appeal. Now, obviously, I've just drawn a lot of conclusions about what the audience response to Shen Yun will be, but the truth is that all audiences will have their own response to the show. Perhaps they will take everything at face value and leave supporting Shen Yun and Falun Gong. Perhaps they will leave hating both of them. But my purpose in making this video is that neither of those binary interpretations feels like a fair response to Shen Yun. We shouldn't take the CCP's side and call them an evil cult. And we also shouldn't take the CCP's dismissal of them as evidence that their beliefs are inherently good. The conclusion I've come to with Shen Yun is that it is the product of a persecuted yet morally dubious Chinese spiritual group, arguing their case to the West in the weirdest, nichest possible way. I can't say that it's succeeding, since the demographic of audience they seem to be courting seems unlikely to accept their arguments about their own virtue. I also can't say that it's harmless, since the spread of Falun Gong means the proliferation of Li's weird moralistic beliefs, which have the potential for real harm when put into practice by his supporters or readers of the Epoch Times. Should you go see Shen Yun? Oh, absolutely not. It supports the beliefs of a man who is arguably a cult leader, it doesn't want an audience that's going to critically engage beyond a binary good and evil, and, crucially, it's way too expensive for a dance show that's only kind of fine. 3.5 stars out of 5. It's difficult to speculate about what Shen Yun's future looks like, just as it's difficult to speculate about what China's next move on the world stage will be. Though it's likely that as the latter expands its influence, the former will respond. Developments like the China before communism tagline do indicate some adjustments to Shen Yun's messaging, so perhaps they will begin to be more forthcoming about their relationship to Falun Gong. As I said, transparency seems to be the only way towards a more complete fulfillment of their goals as Falun Gong adherents and advocates. Then again, given everything I know about them now, I'm not sure I want them succeeding much more than they already are. If the majority of Western audiences see Shen Yun as nothing more than the odd purveyors of some omnipresent posters, that may be for the best. Any deeper and you jump right off the edge of reality and into the digitized, saturated world of propaganda, rumor, and conflicting truths. And you don't want to do that. After all, turning reality into projection is something Shen Yun has patented.
Advertising for Shen Yun is prolific and effusive. In particular, promotional images in London, Detroit, New Jersey, Philadelphia and Arizona have featured one emphatic endorsement.
Absolutely the #1 show in the world. Ken Wells, former lead dancer of the English National Ballet.
But there's one big problem. Ken Wells never said that. PM tracked down Ken Wells, now in his 70s and retired in Austin, Texas.
To use my name on a statement like the best show in the world is a lie. It's cheating the public because it's not true. Well, for Austin, it was quite impressive. I don't know why I've been singled out to be on the damn poster.